Welcome to this trip through one of the scariest cases in U.S. history. We're going to go into the dark parts of the Appalachians today to learn about three sisters who became scary stories that history books have chosen to forget. Leave where you're watching in the comments before we start. Is there anyone in the woods where it all happened? The year was 1873. 8 years had passed since the end of the Civil War, but the United States was still hurting from it. It was the South, wrecked. A lot of things were lost by whole families. And in the mountainous parts of Kentucky and West Virginia, the rule was just a vague thought. On those heights that were always foggy, where the peaks were hidden by low clouds and the valleys held old secrets, a story was born that still makes people in the area lower their voices when it's brought up. People have always thought badly of the Appalachian Mountains. These heavily wooded hills have been mysterious since the time of the first inhabitants. Trails that vanished without a trace. People who came in and never left. At night, strange sounds could be heard coming from the pine trees, but nothing compared to what was about to happen on a small, remote property in Pike County, Kentucky, close to the border with West Virginia. That was where the Whitlock family had lived for many years. Mountaineers are usually tough people who have been through a lot of hard work and being alone. He came home from the war with only one arm and a much worse attitude than before. His father, Jonathan Whitlock. This Sarah, the mother of the triplets, died while giving birth to them in 1852. She left behind 3 identical kids who were named Martha, Clara, and June. Who would have thought that those girls would become something so different 21 years later? It was already hard enough to grow up in those woods without a mother. It was terrible to grow up with an angry and drunk father. The Carpenters were the closest neighbors, but they lived almost 3 miles away on a steep, dangerous path. The area did not have a school. There was no church. There was only the cliffs of the forest and the wild wind that blew through the valleys. The 3 girls learned how to hunt, set traps, and stay alive like wild animals. Jonathan didn't go to Pikeville very often because it was the county home. He always came back drunk and angry, usually after losing money at card games in the saloons. From a young age, the girls learned to hide when they heard his heavy steps going up the trail. They learned not to talk. They learned never to cry. They also learned something darker, that in those woods where there was no one in charge, anyone could do anything and not get caught. In May 1873, the first sign that something was very wrong showed up. Elias Turner was a traveling salesman who stopped at the Whitlock farm to sell medicine, tools, and clothes. At that time, it was normal to do that. Merchants went from farm to farm, bringing the Highlanders news and goods they couldn't make themselves. People in the area knew Elas for years, a nice middle-aged married father of 4 who lived in Prestonburg. Elijah never came back home. His wife didn't call the Floyd County Sheriff for a week. It was planned to look for someone, but in the Appalachians, it was like looking for a needle in a haystack the size of a state. The trails grew, split up, and then vanished. Any sign was lost in deep ravines, and the forest was so thick that a person could be hidden even from just a few meters away. Sheriff Thomas Blackburn, who served in. Soldiers who knew how to track followed Elias's usual path. Farmer friends who had seen him talked to him. 2 people who lived about 10 miles away from the Whitlock property gave the most recent proof. They said Elijah had said they should go there next. It was the last place he went before going home. On a rainy June afternoon, the sheriff and 3 officers went to the Whitlock cabin. They were met by Jonathan on the deck. He looked like he was drunk. He said he hadn't seen any, even though it was only 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Store owner. He said it had been weeks since anyone had been there. The 3 girls showed up at the door and stood there quietly. The sheriff saw something troubling about these 2 young women who looked exactly the same. They didn't move. They didn't move. They did nothing but stare. their eyes empty and as cold as stones. All of them were dressed in dirty, worn-out clothes. Her long, dirty dark hair fell over her shoulders. Something basic about them made the sheriff shiver without meaning to. Blackburn asked to be able to search the house. Jonathan said there wasn't a search order, so he said no. For the most part, he was right. Legal safeguards were taken very seriously at that time, especially in the South, which was still angry about being occupied by the federal government after the war. The sheriff didn't have the power to break in without proof of wrongdoing. He took notes on everything and then went down the mountain with his men, but that visit stuck with him. 3 weeks later, someone else went missing, this time. What it was a traveling preacher named Reverend Isaiah Morton. He went on his own journey to bring God's word to the remote areas of Appalachia. He was 60 years old, thin and weak, and he lived off of the kindness of the faithful. He was last seen going up to the higher mountains where the Whitlock estate used to be. The Reverend also knew the way. More people were scared when the Reverend Morton went missing than when Elias Turner did. Even in the most rural areas, people looked up to preachers. 3 counties' churches got together to help. The trails were searched for days by groups of up to 20 men. They looked in ravines, known caves, and every other possible sign they could think of. Nothing. The preacher had just disappeared into the pine trees like smoke. Sheriff Blackburn went back to the Whitlock homestead. Because of the pattern of disappearances, this time it took 5 detectives and a county judge to search the house. Jonathan was even more mean. He yelled that he was being mistreated and that as a war hero, he deserved better. Understand that his land was important to him, but the law was the law, and Blackburn wasn't going to give up. It took hours to search. The house was small and only had 3 awfully built rooms. There wasn't a basement. There was nothing else in the barn but some old hay bales and broken farm tools. Men looked in every corner, turned over the straw, and looked in the dirt for newly turned dirt. They always stayed together and kept quiet as they watched everything from the balcony. It looked like they were one thing, split into 3 parts. The other ones moved when the first one did. Everyone looked to one side when one looked to one side. Some deputies didn't look straight at them because the behavior was so upsetting. They found nothing at all, that could connect the Whitlocks to the people who went missing. The sheriff had to give up and go back down the mountain. But something about that visit stuck with him. A deep-seated sense that something was very wrong there. It wasn't just the strong, setting of the land or the strange family. There was more to it. He couldn't place the smell in the air. Something bad that seemed to come from the ground itself in the summer of 1873. 3 more people have gone missing. A fur trapper named William Hayes, who was 19 years old and new to the job in the woods. Dr. Samuel Pritchard was a rural doctor who went from farm to farm, helping sick and hurt people. Rebecca Stone was the first woman to be killed by him. Was trying to get across the mountains to get to family in Tennessee after running away from a planned marriage. Each absence happened in the same way, like a macaron. Someone was seen going up to the highest mountains. Someone said that they had pointed out the Whitlock farm as a landmark, or a place where they could get water or a safe place to stay. Then there was nothing at all. It looked like the mountain had swallowed these people up, leaving behind no sign, tip, or thing. Fear began to spread to nearby counties. Newspapers in Pikeville, Prestonburg, and even bigger towns like Lexington started writing about the strange deaths in the mountains. Some people thought of that area as the Valley of Death. Others talked about the angry ghosts of troops who died in battle, ancient creatures that lived in the caves, and curses that were passed down from generation to generation. There have always been stories about the Appalachians, but now they seem to come true. Sheriff Blackburn needed help badly. His good name was on the line. He had been there before. police officer who had caught risky criminals and found soldiers who had deserted during the war. This time, though, I had to deal with something different. There were no dead bodies. No one was there to see it. No concrete proof of a crime was found. There were only people who went into the mountains and never came back. In August of that year, Blackburn made a choice that caused a lot of debate. He got together a group of men he trusted and set up discreet surveillance around the Whitlock farm. Maybe it wasn't legal, but it wasn't clearly illegal either. They set up camp in strategic places along the trails that led to the house, out of sight in the trees, and watched who came and went. It was a dangerous plan. He thought he had no choice because Jonathan might get violent if he found out. Things didn't happen for 2 weeks. Jonathan went to Pikeville a few times and always came back drunk. The 3 women were not seen very often. They only went outside to hunt or get water from a nearby stream. Always with each other and never talking. The men who saw them said they moved through the forest with magical skill and almost no noise, like they were born to be mountain predators. After noon in September, though, everything changed. On the main path, a lone traveler showed up. He was a middle-aged guy riding a bay horse. He was dressed nicely for the area. He had a rifle strapped to his horse and saddlebags that looked full. People on duty saw him go by and then see him heading toward the Whitlock land. They could not warn him without letting him know where he was. They could not do anything but watch as the man climbed the steep road and disappeared into the trees. After 2 hours, the horse went down the trail by itself. There is no rider and no saddlebags. The saddle is empty and the rein is free. The animal was scared, shivering, and turning its ears back as if it had seen something horrible. The watchman caught the horse and took it to the camp of the sheriff. Blackburn made his choice right away. He called together all 12 of his men. They were armed officers who went up to the Whitlock estate. At this point, there would be no talk. There would be no going back this time. The sky was a blood-red color because the sun was setting behind the faraway hills when they got there. It was quiet in the house, but there was no movement. Smoke coming from the chimney showed that there were people inside. Nothing was making noise. There was just a thick, strange silence that covered the space like a cloud. The police officer rang the doorbell. No one picked up. He hit again, harder, and proclaimed his power. Still nothing. He gave the order for 2 deputies to break in. The door was easy to open. It was only leaned against it. The men walked in with their guns drawn, ready for anything. They found an incredibly normal family scene that scared them. A half-drunk bottle of whiskey was sat next to Jonathan at the table. He was no longer alive. Even before he looked at anything, his body was cold and his eyes were cloudy. No signs of fighting could be seen. It looked like he had just. He or she may have died of a heart attack or stroke while sitting there. There were 3 girls sitting on the floor of the room next door, which was a bedroom. They were holding hands and rocking back and forth in a circle. They sang a low-pitched song with a tune that none of the guys knew. When the cops came in, they didn't do anything. They didn't look up. They sang and swayed like they were in a dream the whole time. Police Chief Blackburn's heart sank. There was something deep. What was upsetting about that scene? It wasn't just Jonathan's body or the strange things his sister did. It was the way the place felt. It was tough to breathe because the air was so thick. In some places, the shadows moved around on their own. Also, he could now name that smell. It was the strong but faint smell of death coming from somewhere. Henry Walsh, one of the officers, searched for the source of the noise. He had a strong stomach and had seen violent deaths in the war. Smell. It was quick. There was a trap door in the back of the hut. It was partly covered with straw and old wood. Because it was well hidden and covered in dirt, no one had seen it during earlier searches. Walsh looked at the police chief. Blackburn said, "Yes." It took 2 guys to lift the trapdoor. What was said at that moment would change the past of that area for good. There was an area below the trapdoor that wasn't really a basement, but rather a natural hole in the rock. The mountains in the Appalachians are full of these shapes, caves, and crevasses that were formed by water and shifting rocks over millions of years. Someone had found that opening and built it into the construction of the hut. Inside the stone, in the damp, cold darkness, were the things that belonged to at least 10 different people. There were clothes that were neatly folded and stacked, boots of different sizes, saddlebags that still had food in them, a Bible with the name of the Reverend Isaiah Morton written on the cover, tools for a merchant, and medical equipment that could. A dress for a woman that was definitely made by Rebecca Stone that only belonged to Dr. Pritchard. Everything had a story to tell. There were no bodies, but each piece was quiet proof of a life cut short. That was the most upsetting thing about it all. All of those things, all of those clues about what happened, but no sign of the victims. The men went down with flashlights and looked around every part of that hole. This thing was about 5 meters wide and 8 meters long, and a man could only stand in the middle of it. The stone walls were wet out of limestone. The ground was packed down dirt. The walls had strange marks and symbols scratched into the stone that no one could figure out. At the same time, the 3 women kept singing. 2 cops were told by the sheriff to hold them down. The song stopped when the guys touched Martha, who was the closest. 3 of them turned their heads at the same time, moving in a way that didn't seem normal. They looked at the deputies with eyes that were so dark they were almost invisible. Lamp. They were all so much alike that it was impossible to tell which one smiled. That smile wasn't from a person. It was something wild and dangerous that didn't show any feeling. The cops put chains around the 3 sisters' wrists and handcuffed them. Even though they were tied together, they kept moving and breathing together and turning their heads at the same time to watch the guys. No one said a word. No one tried to explain themselves or ask what was going on, that deep. There was quiet and those empty stares that seemed to cross people. The search went on all night. From Pikeville, more cops were called. They brought sniffer dogs to try to find some sign of the bodies. The animals were upset near the hole. They were barking and growling and wouldn't go down. One of the dogs, a bloodhound that had been used in crawling before, just laid down and howled. The sound echoed through the mountains and gave them chills, as dawn broke and the cool gray light of fall began to. They found something even scarier when they tried to light up that evil property. There were signs of old fires and a lot of bonfires in an area behind the barn that was full of thick plants. Squares of burnt stones marked the ground. There were also pieces of bones all over the ground, too small to be sure of their identities, but clearly bones that had been in very hot fire. One of the cops threw up. Someone else started to pray out loud. Sheriff Blackburn, a tough guy who... He felt his hands shake as he wrote everything down in his notebook after years of war and violence. He had seen soldiers die in battle. He had seen cities burn down. He had seen the worst things people can do to each other. That was different, though. It had more to do with something darker and deeper than normal bloodshed. The 3 girls were put in a cart that was borrowed from a farm next door. They talked, even though they were sitting in different places, Martha in the front, Clara in the middle, and June in the back, moved the same way over and over again. All of them turned their heads when one did. Everyone else blinked when one did. It seemed like they had the same mind, but lived in 3 different bodies. The men who were watching them didn't look right at them. Something about these young women was hard to understand, and it made even the strongest people feel pure fear. It took hours to get down from the mountain. The cart moved slowly along the bumpy path, swaying dangerously on some steep parts. The girls showed. There is no pain. They didn't ask for water. They didn't say anything bad about the currents. They did not try to talk. Being so still was like something from another world. It was like they were waiting for something and only they knew what it was. It was already mid-afternoon when they got to Pikeville. Back then, news spread quickly, even in rural areas where there were no phones or telegraphs. Someone on a horse had spread the word. When the wagon showed up, there were a lot of people on the main street. There were at least 200 people there, mostly family members of the people who went missing. Possible vigilantes who are interested. Anger and fear filled the air, making it tense. The sheriff had to line up his men around the wagon to stop the crowd from coming closer. Some people yelled for justice right away. Some people wanted the sisters to say where the bodies were, but the three of them kept quiet the whole time. Their faces were pale and expressionless, like dead porcelain masks standing behind them. Not even the crowd's anger seemed to be there, to get close to them. It was like they lived in a different world, away from all human feelings and actions. A simple wood and stone building with only 4 small rooms made up the Pikeville jail. The sisters were put in different cells because the sheriff didn't want them to have that strange link with each other. They fought back for the first time since they were caught. The 3 started to yell when the cops tried to separate them. They were not yells of words, but high-pitched sounds that didn't sound like people. A group of guys put their hands over their ears. They were all in perfect sync. There are 3 sounds making the same note at an unbearable volume. The sound stopped all of a sudden after about 30 seconds. The sisters got into their rooms without any more trouble. But now that they were apart, something had changed. Each one went to a different part of her cell and stood there, still as a statue, looking at the wall. They weren't lying down, they didn't sit down. They did nothing but stand there for hours on end. The guards who were watching them said that it was tough to tell if they were awake or asleep. He kept his eyes open, but they didn't blink. Her breasts didn't move much when she breathed. That night, strange things began to happen in the Pikeville jail. Sheriff Lee had left 2 guards on duty. Their names were Robert Mills and James Crawford, and they were both experienced men. Around 11 o'clock at night, Mills said he heard whispers coming from the cells. Just low, rhythmic murmurs that seemed to come from all 3 cells at the same time. There were no clear words. As he got close to, if you looked into it, the whispers stopped right away. It looked like the 3 sisters hadn't moved at all. They stayed where they were, facing the walls. He was sure he saw one of the sisters at 2 o'clock in the morning. A few inches above the floor of his cell, he couldn't tell which one it was. She called Mills, but when they both looked, she was standing normally. The 2 men looked at each other nervously. They both knew they were scared, but neither wanted to say it. There was a heavy presence in that, as if the walls of the building were filled with something bad. When Sheriff Blackburn went to check on the prisoners early in the morning, he saw that his guards were clearly scared. Mills's hands were shaking, and he had dark circles under his eyes. Even though it was a cool morning, Crawford was pale and sweating. Both of them asked to be freed from that duty. Blackburn didn't say anything. When he walked into the hallway where the sisters were locked up, he could feel the heavy air. At the same time, the investigation into the Whitlock estate kept going. Dr. Albert Brennan, the medical examiner for the county, was sent with more men. Jonathan's body was looked at right on the table where he had died. Brennan did not find any obvious signs of violence or poisoning. The man seemed to have died of heart failure, which could have been caused by his heavy drinking. But the doctor was interested in one thing. Like he had seen something scary in the last few seconds, Jonathan's eyes were very big and his pupils were very big. Looking at the bone pieces that were found near the fires has proven what everyone already thought. There were small pieces of skulls, ribs, and long bones from the legs and arms among the bones. All of them had been in temperatures that were very hot. The doctor thought that it would take fires that were kept going for many hours, or even days to get people to that point. The process was very careful and almost ritualistic, like it had been planned and done many times. What was even worse was that a diary was found. Under a loose board in the sister's room, it was hidden. To keep it dry, an oiled cloth was wrapped around it. The mother, Sarah Whitlock, wrote the diary. She had died giving birth 21 years before. Even though the notes were written in shaky handwriting and were smeared in a few places, they were still revealing in ways that no one saw coming. Sarah wrote about how hard it was for her to be pregnant and about the scary dreams she had every night. I have dreams about 3 shadowy figures who... Someone came to see her and whispered things in a language she didn't understand, but somehow got right. She wrote about waking up with scratches on her skin that she didn't remember getting, and feeling more and more like she was carrying something that wasn't completely human. It was hard to read the last few entries, which were written just days before the birth. Sarah talked about seeing 3 girls who were exactly the same, and who would turn out to be terrible adults. She begged God to forgive her, but she asked for forgiveness for something that wasn't clear. It talked about an old cave deep in the mountain. The Cherokee people who lived there before the invaders did ceremonies there that are no longer remembered. She said that she could feel that place calling to her and pulling the babies inside her. The last note in the notebook was just a line of big, shaky letters that went across the page like a cry for help. "They're not mine. They are part of the mountain." Read by Sheriff Blackburn. Those words, while sitting on the porch of Whitlock Cabin and watching the sun go down over the hills below. There was nothing strange about him. He knew enough about the real world to not believe in ghosts or spirits, but he held that book with shaking hands because the words of that woman who had been dead for a long time felt heavy to him. There was something about that rock that went back before the Whitlocks and maybe even before the settlers. The 3 girls were somehow linked to it. Back in Pikeville, getting ready was being done, made for the test. A guy named Nathaniel Pierce was building a case against the sisters as the county prosecutor. It was a complicated court case. There was a lot of clues, like the victim's belongings, bone pieces, and a clear pattern of disappearances, but they didn't have any bodies that could be identified. No one had seen the crime happen, and no one had confessed. The 3 women didn't say a word. Pierce got help from experts in Lexington, including a lawyer with a lot of experience who had worked on crimes like. That involved murder, though that word wasn't used yet. A therapist, who is not common in the area, looked at the sisters through the bars of their cells. Dr. Heinrich Müller, a psychotherapist who was born in Germany and went to school in Europe, watched the young women for 3 days. His report made me feel bad. Müller said that the 3 did not show normal signs of being human. They didn't respond the way you'd expect them to outside stimulation. You couldn't tell if they were scared, angry, sad, or any other feeling. When I tried to talk to them, but they didn't answer or even notice that I was talking, as if they were in a different state of mind and not connected to the world that most people share. Even though they were literally separated in cells that didn't let them make eye contact with each other, the 3 of them continued to act in sync with each other. As soon as one moved, the others moved too, making the same movements. The others started eating at the same time as the first person. Rate. There were many witnesses who saw it happen, even though the rules of nature said it couldn't happen. In his report, Mayer uses careful and scientific language to suggest that the sisters may be suffering from a serious form of folata that has not been previously described. Folata is a mental illness in which delusions are shared among close friends or family. Anyway, even he agreed that it didn't fully explain what he saw there. There was something going on that went beyond normal psychology. That's it. The case became known in more than one county. Someone from a newspaper in Louisville, Cincinnati, or even New York, went to Appalachia to report on what was being called the case of the three evil twins. There were a lot of sensationalist stories that mixed facts with guesses and fantasy. The sisters were said to be witches by some newspapers. Others said it was possession by demons. Some people even thought they were a mix of humans and some kind of mountain creature, the result of some strange trials. Invaders who were crazy did it. Plans called for the hearing to happen on October 15, 1773. The Pike County Courthouse wasn't very big. It was just a simple room that could fit about 50 people. Many people waited outside that day to get a seat for what was supposed to be the most amazing event in the history of the area. It was the first time in 62 years of service for Justice Cornelius Hammond, who had been in charge of that court for more than 20 years. The three girls were brought in. Chains. Their old clothes had been taken as evidence, so this time they wore simple dresses that the sheriff's wife gave them. They were dressed in a very nice way, but there was something wild about them. Even though she combed her hair, it was already dirty again. Their pale faces didn't show any emotion at all. Even though they were tied together, they walked perfectly in sync, as if they were one being moving through three bodies. Pierce, the prosecutor, made his case in an orderly and effective way. He called, over and over again. The things that were found in the space under the Whitlock hut were recognized by family members of the missing. Elias Turner's wife cried when she saw that she had fixed her husband's coat years before. Reverend Morton's children confirmed the Bible that had their dad's name written on it. Rebecca Stone's sister recognized the dress by a certain part of the stitching she had done herself. The doctor showed what he had found when he looked at the bone pieces. He talked about in scientific terms, how the bones had been burned and worked on purpose. He used pictures to show why fires that last for a long time would be needed. Based on the different bone sizes and shapes, he thought that the pieces were the remains of at least 8 different people. Some jurors looked like they were going to throw up because of the evidence. Dr. Mueller talked about his psychiatric findings. He talked about how the sisters were acting strangely and how they didn't seem to have any morals. Mysterious link even when they are apart. He stayed away from words like evil and possession and stuck to science and medicine. But what he said made me think of 3 minds that were working in strange ways that were not at all like regular people. The 3 sisters sat at the defense table and stared straight ahead with blank looks on their faces the whole time. When the victims' things were shown to them, they didn't say anything. When members of the family cried in court, they didn't show any feeling. Stand up. Something was missing from their attention, or they just didn't seem to care about what was going on around them. A young man named Thomas Aldridge, who had just finished from law school 3 years before, was hired by the court to be the defense lawyer. He knew it was impossible to do what he wanted to do. His customers were not at all willing to help him. What they said did not answer his questions. They didn't give any evidence that could have helped their case. He tried to make the case that there wasn't enough solid evidence to say for sure that someone had killed someone without bodies that could be identified, and his hearing was taking place in a public frenzy that made fairness impossible. But even he could tell that his reasons were weak. The truth was that everyone in the room, even the county's 12-person panel, already had an opinion. There was guilt among the 3 women, maybe not in a strict legal sense, but in a more basic and deep way. They stood for something dark and old, in the modern world that polite people would rather think don't exist. Something very strange happened on the 3rd day of the hearing. Based on a small scar on her left hand, the sheriff was able to identify one of the sisters as Martha. She slowly turned her head and looked right at the jury. Any of them had shown that they were aware of what was going on around them for the first time. He looked at all 12 guys and held his attention on each face for a few seconds. There wasn't any. That look is scary. There wasn't any prayer. There was only a cold and judging quality, like a predator looking at possible food. A few jurors turned their heads away because they couldn't make eye contact. One of them, a strong farmer named Jacob Miller, who was known for being brave and tough, looked pale. Afterward, he told other people that when Martha looked at him, it was like she could see right through him, read not only his thoughts, but also something deeper, something that was at the heart of him. His spirit. Martha looked at Judge Hammond after she was done with all the jurors. The two people stood in the courtroom and stared at each other for a long time. It's good that the judge didn't look away. With his strong religion and strong sense of the law, he didn't believe in being scared. But even he found something very troubling about that look. There was an old and huge intelligence there that shouldn't be there in the eyes of a 21-year-old girl who grew up in a cabin in the middle of nowhere. Heights. After that, Martha smiled. Even though it was just a small, arched lip, it changed her whole face. That smile wasn't funny at all. There was no happiness. There was only one thing that made me think of the pleasure of figuring out a puzzle or seeing a plan through to the end. Then she spoke for the first time since she was caught. Her voice was surprisingly soft, almost musical, but she had a way about her that gave people chills. The person she was talking to said only 6 words in clear English. Accent from the area, the rock can't be killed, that was all. After those 6 words, Martha turned her attention to the present and went back to the dead, quiet state she had been in for weeks. People in the hall could smell those words like poison. A few people started to whisper to each other. Even though the judge slammed his gavel in order to give an order, everyone had heard it and was trying to figure out what those mysterious words meant. The jury only talked about the case for 2 hours. They came back and said that was guilty on everything. 11 cases of first-degree murder, which is the number of victims who could be linked to the disappearances for sure. Judge Hammond set the date for the sentence for the following week. At that time, and in that area, the death sentence was the only way to punish multiple murders. The 3 women were going to be hung. The word got around quickly. People began to come to Pikeville from all the counties nearby. People came to get revenge on the killers and see them pay for their crimes. Others came because they were morbidly interested and wanted to. See an event that people will remember for a long time. People set up booths to sell food and drinks. It felt a lot like a fair, which made Sheriff Blackburn very uncomfortable. Even weird things started to happen the night before the execution. He added 6 armed men to the guard and put them in jail. He didn't trust the people who were gathering in the streets. There was a lot of alcohol in the saloons, and groups of drunk people could quickly turn into violent gangs. He wouldn't let He allowed people to be lynched under his watch, even if they were guilty. Around midnight, all 6 guards said they heard chanting coming from the bars. Nobody else was singing, not the 3 women. Dozens of voices could be heard booming through the stone walls, making it sound like they were coming from a long way away. The voices were singing in a language that none of the men knew. It wasn't English. It also wasn't Spanish. It wasn't any of the native languages that some of the guards had heard before. It was something, older, and made sounds that were rough and hurt the ears. A young guard named Peter Sullivan swore that the shadows on the walls started to move without any help from the lights. He saw dark shapes moving around corners. The shapes looked like people, but they were twisted in ways that shouldn't have been possible. Matthew Price, another guard, said that the temperature dropped very quickly in the cell hallway. He could see his breath in the cold air, even though it was October and the temperature outside was still warm. Being nice. At 3 a.m., the singing stopped all of a sudden. It was weird how the quiet after the strange sounds was worse. It felt like everyone in the chain was holding their breath because of the heavy silence. The guards looked around the rooms. The three sisters were standing in the corners and looking at the walls, as they always did. Now, though, there was something different. Illusions were carved into the stone walls of each cell with a very sharp tool. That wasn't something anyone had seen or heard the sisters do. The symbols were very complicated, making geometric designs that move when you look at them directly, which is a disturbing optical illusion. Right away, Sheriff Blackburn was called. When he got there and saw the marks, he felt something he hadn't felt since the worst days of the war. Real fear from the past. I wasn't able to say why. They were just marks on the rock. It was something about them that spoke to an older part of the brain. The part where we could still remember when our ancestors were scared of the dark and not knowing. He told them to clean the rooms and scrape the walls. However, when the men tried to erase the symbols, they found that they were carved deeply into the stone, much deeper than human fingernails or the sisters' handcuff chains, which were the only metal things they had access to. Those marks would have taken hours of hard work with the right tools, but no one had heard anything. The 23rd of October, 1873, dawned with gray skies and low clouds. For that time of year, Pikeville was covered in thick fog, which was strange. It was only possible to see a few meters ahead. The crowd that had gathered during the night was now quiet. They were looking at the jail through the fog like ghosts waiting for a macabre show. It was planned that the killing would happen at 9 o'clock in the morning. The scaffolding was built into the back of the jail. It was a simple wooden frame with 3 ropes that moved slowly in the damp air. 3 ropes for 3 killers. The person who killed them was brought in from someone from a different country who has done this miserable job before. He carefully looked over every knot, tried the rope's strength, and measured the right heights to make sure people died quickly. No matter how bad his work was, he was a worker who did it with care. They were taken in from the building at 8:30. A lot of people in the crowd had never seen them before. When the 3 young women walked in, there was complete silence. They were tied and put to death, but there was something about them that called attention to itself. It wasn't pretty in the usual sense. Even though both of their faces were the same and their features were thin, there was something deeper and more troubling about them that made them seem bigger than their bodies. They had no trouble getting to the platform. They weren't sad. They didn't beg for kindness. They didn't show any sorrow or fear. They moved as if they were one person mirrored in 3 mirrors as they went up the stairs. The priest, whose job it was to do the last rites, tried to talk to them, give them spiritual comfort, or give them a chance to explain. They didn't pay any attention to it at all, as if it didn't exist in their world. The 3 of them were put under the ropes. The knots around their necks were changed. As was the norm, black masks were to be put over their heads. The executioner's helper tried to cover Martha's face, but she turned her head and looked at him straight on. The man stepped back and let the hood fall from his shaking hands, calling out prayers in a low voice. The executioner chose to go ahead without the hoods, so that until the very end, everyone could see the killers' faces. Judge Hammond read the sentence out loud, and his voice echoed in a strange way through the thick fog. He said that Martha, Clara, and June Whitlock had been tried and found guilty of horrible crimes against humanity. As payment for the lives they had taken, their own lives would be taken away. For a long time, he asked if they had any last words. Nothing? Then all 3 of them opened their mouths at the same time and spoke out loud. The mountain remembers. The mountain waits. The mountain always returns. They said these words 3 times at the exact same time, making a strange and unnatural harmonic effect. There was silence. The executioner looked at the judge. Hammond nodded. It was time. The executioner pulled the lever that opened the trap doors under the convicts' feet. The 3 bodies fell. The strings were stretched out, making dry, horrible sounds. Normally, a properly calculated fall would kill instantly from breaking the neck. But something went wrong. The 3 sisters did not die right away. They hung around, bodies writhing for what seemed like forever but was probably less than a minute. During that horrible time, they kept moving in sync. When one leg kicked, the other 2 kicked the same way. When one arm contracted, the other 2 contracted the same way. People who couldn't watch turned around and prayed out loud, and the doctor who was there to confirm the deaths watched in horrified fascination. Finally, the movement stopped, and the 3 bodies stood still, swaying gently on the ropes. The doctor waited the required 5 minutes before checking the pulses. He climbed on stools and touched each neck. There was no heartbeat. The 3 Whitlock sisters were dead. But then something happened that day that will be told for generations. When the doctor said that the 3 people were dead, the mist started to move in a way that wasn't like the wind normally does. It was like the mist was curling up and making circles around the scaffold. The temperature dropped dramatically, and people in the crowd could feel their breath condensing into the cold air. Then there was a sound, a thunderous rumble from the mountains that was deeper and lasted longer, shaking the ground beneath people's feet. A lot of people thought it was an earthquake because the Appalachians did have some, but not very often. It didn't feel natural. It felt like the earth was responding to what had happened. Huge flocks of birds flew out of the trees, screaming and flying in circles. Dogs all over town started howling at the same time. Horses tied to poles pulled their reins, and some managed to get loose and galloped blindly through the narrow streets. The crowd started to gather. Run quickly to your homes or the nearest buildings to get away from something they couldn't describe, but that everyone felt. Sheriff Blackburn, Judge Hammond, and a few other men who tried to stay calm stayed at the scene and watched as the bodies were lowered and put in 3 simple pine coffins that had been prepared ahead of time. The grave diggers, 2 brothers named Samuel and Daniel Foster, loaded the coffins onto a wagon. The plan was they were going to be buried in the city cemetery, but when the cart started to move toward the cemetery, the horses wouldn't move. They were trained animals that were used to pulling heavy loads, but at that moment, they just put their paws on the ground and wouldn't move. The gravediggers tried to get different horses, but no animal would voluntarily approach the cart with the 3 coffins. In the end, it had to be done by hand. The work had to be done by hand, with 10 men taking turns pushing and pulling the cart along the dirt road to the cemetery. It was hard and took a long time. The sky had grown even darker, with ominous black clouds gathering over the city. Lightning started to clear the far horizon, but there was still no thunder. It felt like the end of the world was coming that afternoon, as if heaven itself was seeing and condemning what people had done. But when the gravediggers tried to lower the first coffin, the rope broke. The coffin fell into the grave with a hollow, disturbing sound. They tried again with new, thicker ropes, but the same thing happened with the second and third coffins. It was like the ropes themselves wouldn't do the job. In the end, planks and brute force were used to place the coffins at the bottom of their graves. The priest refused to perform any ceremony because he said that these women had died. Some disagreed, but most quietly agreed. The gravediggers started to cover the bodies with dirt. That's when the storm hit. It wasn't a normal autumn storm, it was a sudden and violent flood, as if the sky had opened. It rained so hard that it was impossible to see from a few meters away. Winds bent the trees and tore roof tiles off. Lightning struck the ground several times, each followed by thunder. The storm only lasted 20 minutes, but it did more damage than any storm the older residents could remember. When it finally stopped, just as quickly as it had started, the men in the cemetery were soaked and covered in mud. The 3 pits were full of muddy water, and they had to wait hours for the water to drain enough to continue the burial. When they finally got it done, it was almost night, and no one wanted to be in that cemetery after dark, so they were in a hurry, putting dirt on top of the graves without any ceremony or care. No tombstone was put up, and the 3 pits were left unmarked, with only rough mounds of new dirt that would soon be covered by plants. It was as if the city wanted to forget about those women, as if not marking their graves would erase the memory of the horrible things they had done. But memories are hard to erase, and in the days and weeks that followed their execution, it was clear that something was still going on. They began having dreams. Dozens. And a lot of people in Pikeville have said they had the same nightmares. They saw 3 figures standing in the mountains and calling over and over again. They saw strange symbols scratched into stone that burned with cold light. They heard voices singing in languages that hadn't been spoken in thousands of years. Sheriff Blackburn was one of those people. He woke up every night at 3 a.m., the exact time that the chance had ended in jail that previous night. He felt like someone was watching him from his room, even though he never saw anything. His wife noticed that he stopped looking at the mountains to the north, the same mountains where the Whitlock estate used to be. Judge Hammond's hands started shaking in a way that he couldn't control. He tried to hide it from everyone, but it was always there. At night, when he was alone in his office, he sometimes heard whispers. He could never understand the words, but the tone was right. Clearly mocked and hinted at something terrible that was to come. Strange things started to happen to the judges. For example, Jacob Miller, the farmer who turned pale when Martha looked at him during the trial, woke up one morning to find all of his animals dead. 30 cows, a dozen pigs, and chickens had all died during the night without any signs of violence or illness. They were just dead, as if something had sucked their life out. Another juror lost his home in an unknown fire, and another had all. It seemed like the plants were poisoned because they withered and turned dark overnight. Then the disappearances began again, not as often as they were during the sisters' reign of terror, but often enough to keep everyone on edge. A child who was playing near the forest was never seen again. An experienced hunter who knew those mountains like the back of his hand went missing. A peddler who went through Pikeville and was last seen following the road that led north into the mountains. After the execution in the spring of 1874, a group of 15 armed and experienced men were sent to investigate the old Whitlock estate. The sheriff had heard from people living far away that they saw strange lights in the area at night. These lights weren't like the lights from a bonfire. They seemed to move between the trees on their own and flashed in regular patterns, sometimes making circles or other strange geometric shapes. Blackburn put together the group. They brought food, camping gear, and strong lamps. It was harder to climb the familiar trail than it had been before because the plants had grown quickly over the winter, as if the forest itself was trying to reclaim that area and erase any signs of human presence. Branches blocked the way where the trail used to be clear, and roots had grown through the worn-down ground, creating dangerous obstacles. It took them 2 days to get to the property. When they got to the hut in the forest, they all stopped without meaning to. The place had changed. The hut was still standing, but it looked like it was falling apart at an impossible rate. The wood was rotting and covered in moss, making it look like decades had passed instead of just 6 months. The roof had partially collapsed, and all the windows were broken, but no one knew how or why. The place had the look of an ancient ruin, something that should have taken years to happen but had happened in months. What was more disturbing was the way the men felt. They felt like they were being watched by invisible eyes and knew instinctively that they were not welcome. The horses they had brought were restless and neighing and trying to get back along the trail. They had to tie them tightly to trees far from the cabin, where they seemed less agitated. The sheriff and his men approached the broken-down building carefully. The front door was open and hanging only on a hinge. Inside it was dark and cold, even though the sun was shining outside. The ground was wet and unstable in some places, and the furniture was rotting and covered in mold and fungus. But it wasn't the state of the cabin itself that caught his attention. It was the symbols. The inside walls were covered with the same symbols that had been found in the jail cells, but they were much bigger and more complicated here. They covered every surface, weaving them into intricate patterns that hurt your eyes after a while. Some of the men said that the symbols moved when they weren't looked at directly, rearranging themselves into new patterns. One of the deputies, a young man named William Carter, who wasn't involved in the original case, laughed nervously and said that they were just nonsense. He reached out and touched one of the symbols. As soon as his fingers touched the marked wood, he screamed and pulled his hand back. His palm was burned, red, and painful, but the wood was fine. Carter wrapped his hand in a cloth and stood pale and quiet for the rest of the expedition. They went down into the hole under the hut. The trap door was open, just like they had left it months before. The makeshift wooden staircase was rotten, but still workable. 3 men, including the sheriff, went down. The space was exactly the same as they remembered it, except there was now a hole in the middle of the hole where there had been only a dirt floor before. The hole was only a few inches across, but it felt incredibly deep. When they threw a stone in, they didn't hear it hit the bottom. From deep inside the hole came a sound, a low, steady humus, if something very large were vibrating in the earth. And sometimes, mixed in with the buzzing, there was something that sounded like voices singing the same strange melody that the guards had heard in jail the night before the murder. They were told to leave the hole right away by the sheriff. That sound spoke to our deepest fears and told an ancient part of our brains to run, to move away, and never to come back. When they came out, they all agreed in silence that the hole should be sealed. They started throwing big stones into it to try to fill it, but no matter how many they threw, it stayed empty. It was like they were throwing things into a hole with no bottom. They finally gave up and covered the trapdoor with as many heavy planks and stones as they could find. They knew it wouldn't help, but they had to do something because they felt so helpless. They had killed the 3 sisters and won, but it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like the end of a chapter in something much bigger and older. They decided to burn the hut because that was the only way to make sure that no one would get in, that no one else would be drawn to that spot, and that no one else would see the symbols on the walls. They put dry wood around the structure, poured kerosene on top of it, and set it on fire. The flames spread quickly and rose high into the afternoon sky. The rotten wood burned surprisingly hot, as if it was eager to be eaten, but when the fire reached the walls with the symbols, something strange happened. The flames turned deep greens and purples that hurt the eyes. The men ran away and watched from a safe distance as the hut burned down. It took hours because the fire burned with an unnatural intensity, leaving only ashes and a few blackened stones from the foundation. When it finally went out, when only ashes and blackened stones from the foundation were left, the men's eyes looked cold instead of hot. The sheriff noticed something strange about the ashes. They were as black as coal, but when touched, they didn't get dirty. They were instantly cold, as if they had never been near fire, and in some places the ash had settled into patterns that looked like the symbols on the walls. That night, they camped a long way from what was left of the Whitlock property. No one slept well because they could hear sounds coming from the nearby forest. It sounded like big things were moving through the trees. There were strange animal tracks, and there was always that distant sound of 3 voices singing a melody that seemed to have been there before humans. They left quickly in the morning, going down faster than going up because everyone wanted to get out of there. When they finally came out of the mountains and saw Pikeville in the distance, they all felt a strong urge to go. They were relieved, but they also knew without having to argue that nothing had been solved. The three sisters were dead and buried. The hut was destroyed, but the mountain stood, and the mountain remembered. In the years after the 1874 expedition, the story of the Whitlock sisters became part of dark Appalachian folklore. It wasn't told for fun, though. It was told as a warning. People in the area learned to stay away from certain parts of the mountains, especially near where the Whitlock estate had been. People who used to walk those trails without fear now took long detours to avoid going there. Families who lived in more remote areas started moving to more populated areas, leaving behind huts and land that their families had lived on for generations. Sheriff Blackburn was never the same after that last expedition. He kept his job for another 3 years, but something fundamental about him had changed. Her hair turned completely white before she turned 50. I started to shake whenever someone brought up the subject. In 1877, he quit his job without giving a reason and moved to Louisville with his family. Louisville was a big, busy city, and the mountains were just a faraway line on the horizon. He never talked about what he saw on that last trip, but people who knew him well said he woke up screaming at night, always at the same time, with the same look of terror in his eyes. Judge Hammond stayed in Pikeville, but he wouldn't take any cases that involved crimes that happened in the most remote mountainous areas. His hand, shaking, got worse over time, and in 1880, he had what doctors called a nervous breakdown. He spent his last years in a mental institution in Lexington, where he spent his days drawing the same symbols over and over again on any surface. His drawings were burned every day, but he always redrew them. When he died in 1883, his last words were the same ones Martha had said in court: "The mountain remembers." The jurors in the first trial had different outcomes, but they all. 9 of the 12 men died in strange ways before they turned 60. Jacob Miller, the strong farmer who had lost all his animals, went missing during a storm in 1879, and his body was never found, even after many searches. Another juror was found dead in his own bed, with no signs of violence or illness. He was just staring at the ceiling with wide eyes. Finally, a third man slowly went crazy, saying that he saw 3 identical women watching him from afar wherever he went. Going, always on the edge of his vision, always going away when he looked directly. The 3 jurors who lived to be old all did the same thing. They all left Pike County and never came back. One went to Pennsylvania, another to Ohio, and the third to California, putting the whole continent between them and those mountains. When interviewed in their later years, they all refused to talk about the trial. They changed the subject because they were clearly upset. It was as if just remembering it could bring them back to life. The cemetery where the 3 sisters were buried also became the site of strange events that no one could explain. The grave diggers said that the earth over the 3 pits never settled completely. No matter how many times it was pounded or planed, it always went back to making irregular mounds. Plants wouldn't grow over the graves. Other pits were quickly covered with grass and weeds, but those 3 stayed like open wounds in the ground, patches of dark, barren soil that stood out. Visitors to the cemetery, especially at dusk, said they heard whispers coming from the graves and saw shadows moving between the tombstones, even on nights when there was no moon and there shouldn't have been enough light to make shadows. Some said they saw 3 identical women watching from the cemetery's edges, but they would disappear when someone got close. Many people thought these stories were just superstitions or people's imaginations running wild. The stories from 2 reliable witnesses were too consistent to be easily thrown out. Then, in 1886, 13 years after the execution, something very strange happened. A strong earthquake hit the area. This doesn't happen very often in Appalachia, but it did. The quake did some damage in Pikeville, breaking walls and knocking down some chimneys. But in the cemetery, the effect was much worse. The Whitlock sisters' 3 graves fell over, like there was nothing under them. The gravedigger went to check out the graves after the earthquake and found that they were completely empty. The coffins were gone, and there was no tunnel or other sign that they had been found. They were just gone. The gravedigger used a rope and flashlight to go down to the bottom of one of the graves and found nothing but solid earth and stone. There was no sign of rotting wood, no piece of tissue, and no sign of human remains. It was as if the bodies had never been buried there, as if the whole execution and burial had been a lie. The news spread quickly, but there was tense silence instead of public alarm. It was as if everyone knew deep down that asking too many questions or looking into too much would be dangerous. The event was recorded in county files as the damage to 3 graves caused by earthquakes. No search or investigation was organized, and the graves were left unmarked and filled back in. But people continued to disappear in the mountains, though not as often as the Whitlock case. Every few years, someone would go into those mountains and not come back, always in the same general area and always without leaving a trace or clue. The police have learned to record these cases as lost in rough terrain, or likely attacked by wildlife, because it was easier than facing the truth that everyone knew but didn't want to admit. As the 19th century ended and the 20th began, the story of the Whitlock sisters took a new turn. Documents were lost or burned in convenient fires, and old newspapers rotted in neglected archives. People who were there and could remember the events died, taking their first-hand accounts with them. It was as if there was an unspoken effort to erase that history from Pike County's official memory. But stories are stronger than writing and paper, and they lived on in the mountain families, told from one generation to the next in a careful way. People used to whisper around campfires or on stormy nights when the wind howled through the canyons. By the early 1900s, modernization and industrialization had arrived, even in the most remote parts of Appalachia. Many people hoped that the old superstitions would finally die out. Railroads were built, roads were improved, electricity reached smaller towns, and phones linked communities that used to be separated by long travel times. The world was getting smaller, brighter, and less mysterious. The mountains didn't change much, and the disappearances kept happening. In the 1920s, a young historian at the University of Kentucky named Theodore Ashwood became interested in the mountain legends. His grandmother had lived in Pikeville when he was a child and told him stories about the Whitlock sisters. Ashford decided to look into the truth behind the legends to separate fact from fiction and properly record what had really happened in those dark days of 1873. He spent months looking through archives, a dusty courtroom basement, and talking to the children and grandchildren of people who were involved in the original case. He was able to find pieces of the story, the record of the trial, which was incomplete, some yellowed newspaper articles, and surprisingly, the coroner's report. More importantly, he was able to find 3 people who were still alive, who were children at the time of the execution, and remembered seeing the sisters being led to the scaffold. Everyone remembered the strange fog and the sound of the strings being stretched in the mountains. Everyone also remembered the feeling that something much bigger and older than those 3 young women was there that day. One of the witnesses, Elizabeth Porter, 78, said something that Ashford would never forget. Those young men were not evil. They were just servants. The real evil is still up there in those mountains. Ashford decided to do something that no one had done in decades. He would climb up to the site of the old Whitlock estate and write down what was there. He hoped that he would find physical evidence that would help put the story in better context. It was the summer of 1927, and he went alone, against the advice of almost everyone he talked to. He brought camping gear, a camera, and notebooks. It took him 3 days to find the place because the trails had been eaten away by the trees. It took him a while to find the spot because it was covered in thick vines and trees had grown through the foundation of the hut. When he did, he could only tell it by the blackened stones that marked the spot where the hut had been. There was something in the air that he couldn't describe that made him feel very uneasy. Ashford took pictures, measured everything, and carefully wrote everything down. I was looking for the entrance to the... As the sun went down, he saw a hole under where the cabin had been. He had planned to camp there for one night, but as it got dark and the sounds of the forest changed, something in his brain told him to leave. It wasn't logical fear. It was pure, instinctual terror. He quickly gathered his gear and started to descend the mountain, but he couldn't make it because the darkness caught up with him before he got far enough. He had to quickly set up camp in the hole, cut out a small area, start a fire, and wait for dawn. It was the longest night of his life. He heard things moving in the darkness beyond the circle of light from the campfire. They weren't normal animals. The sounds were too deliberate and smart. Then he heard voices, 3 voices singing in harmony coming from deep in the mountain. It was the same melody that had been written about in ancient texts, and the same chant that the guards had heard in jail decades earlier. Ashford didn't believe. As he sat with his back against a tree and fed the fire all night, he prayed that dawn would come soon. When it did, he went down the mountain faster than he had climbed it, almost running on the steepest parts. When his photos were developed, they only showed plants and stones, but some of them had shadows that didn't match any visible light source and blurred shapes in the background that could be film flaws or something else. Ashford never said what they were. A note reading, "Some stories are not to be told. Some truth should not be known. Let the mountains keep their secrets," was found in a box in the attic of his house after he died in 1952. His family gave the materials to the university's archives, where they remain to this day, rarely consulted and almost forgotten. But the story doesn't end there. Even now, more than 150 years after those terrible events of 1873, people who live in mountainous areas of East and West Virginians still know the story and avoid certain areas. They still warn tourists and visitors who want to explore the most remote parts of Appalachia. Rangers report that sometimes people go missing, like hikers who go off marked trails and are never found, or experienced hunters who have known those mountains for decades but get lost and disappear. And there are reports. There are always reports. People say they saw 3 identical women. Mountain watchers who are always dressed in an old-fashioned way, never move, and always disappear when someone blinks or looks away. Campers who hear strange songs at night, melodies in languages they don't recognize. Photos taken on remote trails that show figures in the background that no one saw when the photo was taken. Always 3 figures. Skeptics say it's all just folklore, the superstitions of people from the country, or made-up stories told to kids. Some people think that the Whitlock sisters were just 3 crazy women who did horrible things and paid the price. Others think that everything that happened afterward was just a bunch of coincidences and the mind's way of making sense of chaos and the unknown. But people who live near Appalachia know that there are places in the world where the line between the natural and the supernatural is blurry. These are places where the supernatural isn't as strong. These are places where ancient things still live, places where the earth holds memories and secrets that shouldn't be disturbed. And they know that Martha Clara and June Whitlock, if those were really their names, were just temporary manifestations of something much older and more patient. The mountain remembers, the mountain waits, and the mountain always comes back. These words ring through the years, just as true today as they were on that dark October day. Some people can still hear that faraway song on moonless nights, when the wind blows cold through the canyons and the pine trees whisper old secrets. It's three voices singing a melody that existed before words and will exist after the last word is forgotten. The Whitlock sisters were so bad that their history was erased, buried, and purposely forgotten. But forgetting is not the same thing as erasing, and there are things in this world, in the shadows of old mountains, that can't be killed by ropes, burned by fire, or quenched by time. There are things that just wait. If you've made it this far in this journey through one of the most disturbing and forgotten cases in American history, I hope you've learned something that makes you think about the mysteries that still exist in the world. If this story touched you in any way, please leave a comment below. Let us know what you think. Subscribe to the channel to see more disturbing cases like this one. Also, share this video with anyone who likes true historical mysteries. The more people who know about these cases, the less likely it is that they will be forgotten. Until the next journey in the shadows of